Hello, everyone, and welcome back as we wrap up Chapter 8 on the Age of Imperialism. Please title your notes for today, Foreign Powers in Asia. Previously, we talked about European interests in Africa. We talked about the Belgians in the Congo. We talked about the British in the southern part of the continent, as well as their exploitation and manipulation of the African populations living there. Now we're going to turn our attention toward Asia, particularly in China today. Please keep in mind when you cover United States history your sophomore and junior years, you'll also explore American interests in a lot of the islands in the South Pacific, in the East Pacific, islands like Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. But for the sake of our course, we're really going to be focusing on the world stage. So just to set the stage and really get us started for today, it's important to note that European nations had originally made contact with Asia during the dawn of discovery, way back in Chapter 3 of our course. No colonization took place at that time, though, as the Japanese and the Chinese sensed that Europeans were attempting to encroach on their land and were moving in. They really closed their borders and resort to this policy of isolationism. Think of like the ethnocentric ideas we talked about toward the beginning of this year. So China was largely self-sufficient, a massive country with its own resources, no need to, necessarily trade with Europe. They did have the Silk Road, but it was a very limited path in terms of what was going back and forth between these two very different parts of the globe. They rejected the strange objects of the West and were very ethnocentric and really perceiving Europeans to be lesser than the Chinese. But now with, more connection, industrialization, imperialism, Europeans have more of a desire for Chinese goods than ever before, and they realize that accessing the Chinese market and the Chinese population could make them a fortune. So what I'd like you to do is take a look at primary source A. This is a letter to Queen Victoria, the monarch of Great Britain during this time, and I want you to answer the question that follows. What was occurring in China due to the rising trade with Great Britain, and how did Commander Lin attempt to reason with Queen Victoria about the issue? Again, pause the video here, answer that question, and then resume to go over it together. So as you can see in the primary source, the British were basically introducing opium to the Chinese people, which led to a large strain of addiction. And the commissioner here is saying that why would they be dumping this poisonous drug into China? He asks, like, would she subject her own people to something like this? And just to add a little bit more clarity here, opium was an extremely addictive substance that the Europeans were hoping that they could sell to the Chinese. So this is a narcotic. It's habit forming, and typically what would happen was the Europeans would get the Chinese population very addicted to this. They would leave opium like in the population, let people take it, develop an addiction, and then sell it to them. So by 1835, 12 million Chinese people had become very much addicted to opium, largely because of the British. So now take a look at primary source B and then answer the question that follows. What argument is the commissioner making about the hypocrisy of the opium trade? You can see in this highlighted portion that the smoking of opium is strictly forbidden in Great Britain, and yet the British are attempting to addict the Chinese population to this drug and then sell it to them. Just to showcase the number of imports of opium into China between 1650 and 1880, you can see there is just a steady and massive growth in terms of what is being shipped there. And here you can see the opium stock in the British East India Company warehouse, where all of this opium will eventually be transported into China. This is an illustration of Chinese opium smokers, and you can see, based on their faces, how opium affects the physical human body. So the King Emperor demanded that the British stop addicting the Chinese to opium. The British refused, and in 1839, the first of two different wars, the Opium War I and the Opium War II, originally broke out. And you can see that this was largely a war that took place on the seas. These are British East India iron steamships destroying Chinese war junks in the Anson Bay. So it's just some very brief additional things. This is a war that is going to be taking place almost exclusively by ship. And because the British Navy was so superior, the Chinese suffer a humiliating defeat to the British. The British end up getting Hong Kong. They say that they're going to hold on to it for 100 years. It was eventually returned to the Chinese. And China as a country is carved up into what are called spheres of influence. And you can see these are the spheres of influence here. This is going to be extremely relevant for our course going forward. So this is the year 1900. So we're in the 20th century now. And you can see all of the different European nations and the claims that they're laying in China. Up toward the north, notice that Mongolia and Manchuria are being claimed by the Russians. This is going to be extremely relevant as we enter the era of the Great Wars. The British are going to get the most populous and industrialized area of China through the center. So these are all of their most famous cities. They will also get Hong Kong. And the French will get French Indochina and the southern part of East Asia. This is going to be extremely relevant going into the Vietnam War because it's conflict with the French that really starts that conflict and the steady growth of communism in the region. The Americans step in to try to help the French, and that really is the very beginnings of the Vietnam War. So lots of history to unpack here, a lot of it really linked to this age of imperialism. This is a very famous political cartoon from the time. This is actually a French cartoon. So just to dissect this a little bit, what you're seeing are all of the major European powers from the time. This is a French cartoon again. So instead of China, it's Xin. And you can see this is like the French patron. And they all look very dastardly and very manipulative. At the time, French was in an alliance with Russia. So you can see why they look the least scheming of everyone. Obviously, a very racist depiction of the Chinese figure up here on the top. And we have the Kaiser, Queen Victoria, and the Japanese emperor over here on the side, all scheming to carve things up. The French are portrayed as like this innocent figure, gently laying their hand on Tsar Nicholas as he looks on, also wanting a piece of the pie, but not nearly as aggressive. And just another chart showcasing the spheres of influence. The British also have control of India after the fall of the Mughal Empire. So the British have a sizable empire now in Asia. For our final primary source, take a look at primary source C. This is the first open door note or the first attempt of the United States to step in and open up China to trade with the rest of the world. So take a look at this question. What was John Hay's open door policy regarding competing U.S. and European trade interests in China? So the idea is supposed to be that China is going to be open for all powers to trade with. And the idea is that these spheres of influence are going to enjoy perfect equality of treatment. So instead of like warfare between all of these countries who are trying to carve up China, they're going to occupy it like in this coexistence, and they're all going to make money off of it. Is this manipulative? Is this like a foreign invasion? Yes, but this is like how the U.S. is conducting diplomacy to prevent a massive conflict from breaking out in Asia during the time. So just to sum this up, China was extremely important for U.S. trade. They didn't want to lose their trade partner as they're watching the whole country be carved up into spheres of influence. The open door policy is created by Secretary of State John Hay, and it basically opens Chinese trade up to all nations, protecting the U.S. trade and protecting China from full colonization and being taken over. And in this cartoon, you can see the personification of the United States, Uncle Sam, stepping in and stopping all of the nations from literally cutting up China and taking it for themselves. In terms of some internal problems within China, the population was growing at an enormous rate, so that became a very substantial problem. And by 1850, the population was 430 million, by far the most populated country in the world. Hunger was incredibly widespread, and now with this growing addiction to opium, the country was in quite a bit of chaos. Also, a lot of discontent with the Qing dynasty, and a big question became, are they losing the mandate of heaven? So as faith in the Qing Empire really started to wane over time, they're watching all these foreigners invade. They're watching widespread hunger. They're watching, this massive opium addiction. We end up with the Chinese people largely feeling humiliated, and they start resenting all foreigners, especially Christians who are invading their country. Some peasants formed a secret organization or society called the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists. They were nicknamed the Boxers in most European countries and in the US because their fighting tactics, many people thought, mirrored boxing, which was like, a much more European, Americanized art form. So take a look at this final source. This is secondary source A, and then answer the question that follows. Why were the members of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists unafraid to go into battle? So just to go over this together, members in the society would undergo a ritual where basically they would be made to believe that they were under a spell and that they were actually immune to bullets. Um, in the initiation ceremony, blanks were being fired at them, so it was a clear manipulation. But it just goes to show what kind of society this actually was, and that they don't stand very much of a chance against these European powers when they actually fall into conflict. So the Boxers were martial artists. They were mystics. They end up attacking Beijing, and their goal is to rid China of foreigners. The Qing Empress, the Empress Dowager, has a very difficult decision to make. Does she stand by the European nations who have conquered her own land, or do they support the Boxers? In the last minute, the Chinese end up supporting the Boxers, and all of the nations band together to put down the rebellion, sending in 2,000 troops, and they fine China $330 million. They also forbid China from having any gun imports for 2 years. So some very harsh restrictions. Here you can see all the foreign armies assembling and marching into the Forbidden City. This is a depiction of British and Japanese soldiers descending on the Forbidden City. And here you can see American troops invading China as well. This is also significant in the fact that this is one of the first times we're going to see the United States really stepping onto the world stage as a global superpower. Like they're moving in that direction. Also through their diplomacy by having this open door note through John Hay, you're seeing the United States really step up into this leadership role that we really have not seen them in previously.